The sun was beginning to set as Ashley Harris, a highly skilled and respected Secret Service agent, drove through the familiar streets of her neighborhood. After a long and exhausting day at work, all she wanted was to get home, kick off her shoes, and have a moment of peace. Her days were filled with high-stakes decisions, national security briefings, and the constant pressure of her role, but today had been especially taxing. She had just wrapped up an intense meeting about a potential cyber threat that could disrupt critical infrastructure. Despite her fatigue, she remained composed, her mind quietly processing the events of the day as she navigated her way home. Ashley wasn't the type to flaunt her position or power. Even though her role in the Secret Service came with a level of prestige, she preferred to keep a low profile when off duty. That's why she drove a sleek but understated sedan rather than something flashy. Today, however, she had taken a colleague's car, a decision that would soon have consequences far beyond what she could imagine. The car was a new, expensive model, and its registration wasn't in her name. She hadn't thought twice about borrowing it for a quick trip through her own neighborhood, a quiet suburban area she had lived in for years. As she turned down one of the main roads, her thoughts drifted to how much this neighborhood had changed. Once a peaceful, predominantly middle-class enclave, the area had recently seen a rise in minor crimes, car break-ins, home burglaries, and a few cases of vandalism. This had led to an increased police presence, with patrols making rounds more frequently than usual. While the added security should have made her feel safer, there was an unsettling undercurrent to the way the officers conducted themselves, particularly toward residents who, like her, were black. Ashley, of course, had nothing to worry about. She was a professional, and her work in cybersecurity and national security meant that she was beyond reproach. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that being black in a predominantly white neighborhood brought with it a set of silent judgments and unspoken suspicions. It wasn't something she dwelled on often, but there were always reminders, subtle looks from neighbors, an occasional extra question from store clerks. Today, however, she was simply too tired to care. All she wanted was to get home and decompress. As Ashley approached a familiar intersection, the faint hum of a police siren cut through the air. Two police officers, Jackson and Riley, were on patrol in the area. Jackson, a veteran cop in his late 40s, had developed a reputation over the years, one that wasn't particularly flattering. He was known for his tough guy attitude, quick judgments, and deeply ingrained racial biases, though he'd never admit to any of it. His younger partner, Riley, was still new to the force. Fresh-faced and eager to prove himself, Riley often found himself following Jackson's lead, unsure of how to navigate the complexities of police work and the racial dynamics that often came with it. As they cruised through the neighborhood, their eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary, Jackson's attention was immediately drawn to the car Ashley was driving. It wasn't just that it was a high-end sedan, it was that the driver didn't seem to fit the profile of someone who should be behind the wheel of such an expensive car, at least not in Jackson's eyes. "That doesn't look right," Jackson muttered, narrowing his eyes as he took in the sight of Ashley behind the wheel. Riley glanced over but didn't immediately share Jackson's suspicion. "What do you mean?" Jackson scoffed, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Come on, kid. Look at her. That car. In this neighborhood, she doesn't belong here." Riley hesitated, unsure how to respond. He had been partnered with Jackson long enough to know that his senior officer often made snap judgments about people, especially those who didn't fit his narrow view of who belonged. Still, Riley wasn't about to challenge Jackson's authority. Instead, he simply nodded, keeping his doubts to himself. Jackson, emboldened by Riley's silence, flipped on the patrol car's lights, the blue and red flashing in Ashley's rearview mirror. The sound of the siren startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced in the mirror, her brow furrowing in confusion. There was no reason for the police to stop her. She wasn't speeding, hadn't run a light, everything was perfectly normal. But as the siren continued to blare behind her, she sighed and signaled to pull over, her hands instinctively going to her purse to retrieve her ID and Secret Service badge. As Ashley's car came to a stop on the side of the road, Jackson and Riley pulled up behind her. The street was quiet, the fading sunlight casting long shadows over the houses and trees. There were a few people out for evening walks, but no one paid much attention to the unfolding scene. It was, after all, just another routine traffic stop, or so it seemed. Jackson stepped out of the patrol car with a swagger, adjusting his belt as he approached Ashley's window. His hand hovered near his holster, a habit he'd developed over the years, one that was meant to assert dominance and control. For Riley followed behind him, keeping a few steps back, his expression more cautious than aggressive. Ashley rolled down her window, her face calm but clearly tired. "Good evening, officers. Is there a problem?" Jackson didn't bother with pleasantries. "License and registration," he barked, his tone sharp. Ashley, unfazed, handed him her driver's license and the car's registration. "Here you go," she said, her voice steady. "I'm also a Secret Service agent. If you need to see my credentials, I have them here." Jackson barely glanced at her license before his eyes flicked up to meet hers. His gaze was cold, distrustful. "Secret Service, huh?" His tone was dripping with sarcasm. "Sure you are." Riley shifted uncomfortably behind him, sensing the tension but unsure of how to diffuse it. He glanced down at the registration in Jackson's hand, noticing that the car wasn't registered in Ashley's name. Jackson seized on this immediately. "This car's not registered to you. Who does it belong to?" Ashley remained calm, though she could feel the familiar knot of frustration forming in her chest. She had dealt with situations like this before, people doubting her, questioning her legitimacy simply because she was black, but she couldn't afford to let her emotions get the better of her now. "It belongs to a colleague," she explained. "I borrowed it for the day." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "A colleague, huh? That's convenient." He took a step closer, his posture becoming more aggressive. "You don't look like someone who belongs in this car." Ashley's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her composure. "Officer, I've given you my identification and I've told you who I am. If there's an issue, I'd be happy to call my supervisor." Jackson wasn't interested in listening. He had already made up his mind about Ashley, and nothing she said was going to change that. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his hand moving to unclip his holster. Ashley hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She knew her rights, knew that she had done nothing wrong, but she also knew that defying a police officer could escalate the situation in ways she couldn't control. Reluctantly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out onto the pavement. Ashley stood by her car, the evening air cool against her skin. Despite the tension mounting, her face remained composed, though the knot in her chest tightened with each second. She had been in high-pressure situations before, situations far more dangerous than this, but something about this moment felt different. The weight of her identity, her professionalism, and the reality of her skin color hung over her like a cloud. She knew that, despite all her accomplishments, all the respect she had earned in her field, none of that mattered right now. To these officers, she was just another suspect. Officer Jackson circled her car slowly, his eyes scanning every inch of the vehicle, looking for any excuse to justify his suspicions. His partner, Riley, stood off to the side, observing but saying nothing. The younger officer's face reflected uncertainty, and while he wasn't as aggressive as Jackson, his silence in the face of what was happening only added to the sense of unease. Jackson stopped at the driver's side door, his hand resting on the roof of the car as he turned to Ashley, who was standing just a few feet away, her hands calmly at her sides. "You say this car belongs to a colleague, right?" Jackson asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Ashley nodded. "That's correct. It's registered to him. I can give you his name and number if you'd like to verify." Jackson snorted, shaking his head as if the very idea was laughable. "Oh, I'm sure you've got a name ready to give me. But here's the thing, this car doesn't belong to you, and you're driving around in a neighborhood where you don't belong." The last part of his statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ashley felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain steady. "This is my neighborhood," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I live just a few blocks from here." Jackson took a step toward her, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to see through her, trying to break the calm exterior she was holding onto. "Sure you do," he muttered, his voice low and condescending. "You don't think I've heard that one before?" Ashley's hands clenched slightly at her sides. She knew this game. It was a game of control, a way to strip away her dignity, little by little. The more she responded, the more he would push. But staying silent would only make it worse. She needed to find the right balance, a way to de-escalate without giving him the satisfaction of power. "Officer," she said, choosing her words carefully, "I understand you're doing your job, but I've done nothing wrong. I'm a federal agent, and I'd like to resolve this peacefully. If you need to speak to my supervisor." Jackson cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Your supervisor? Please, you really think I'm going to buy this Secret Service nonsense?" His gaze flicked over her, judging, belittling. "You don't exactly look the part." At this, Ashley felt a wave of frustration rise up in her chest. It wasn't the first time someone had doubted her qualifications, dismissed her because of how she looked. But in this moment, the sheer injustice of it stung more than usual. She had worked hard, sacrificed so much, only to be reduced to this just another black woman being treated like a criminal without cause. Jackson, sensing her frustration, pressed forward. "Why don't you tell me what you're really doing out here? In a car like this, in this neighborhood? You've got drugs in the car, don't you?" Ashley's jaw tightened, and she fought the urge to roll her eyes. "No, officer, I don't have drugs. And I've given you everything you need to verify who I am. If you have any doubts, call my supervisor." So Jackson wasn't listening anymore. His mind had already made up the narrative that suited him best. He took a step back, motioning for Riley to move in closer. "Check the car," Jackson ordered, his voice leaving no room for hesitation. Riley hesitated for a brief second. He wasn't entirely comfortable with how this was playing out, but he also knew better than to question Jackson in front of a suspect. Reluctantly, he moved toward the car, giving Ashley a brief glance as he passed her. There was something apologetic in his eyes, but it wasn't enough to stop him from following orders. Ashley felt her heart rate increase as she watched Riley begin to search the vehicle. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she could see no clear way out. She had done everything right, complied with their requests, offered her credentials, and yet here she was, standing on the side of the road, watching them tear through her belongings like she was a criminal. Jackson leaned back against the patrol car, his arms crossed over his chest as he watched the scene unfold. His smug satisfaction was palpable, and it grated on Ashley's nerves. "So," he said casually, "how long have you been doing this?" Ashley turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Doing what?" Jackson shrugged, his smirk widening. You know, whatever scam you've got going on here. You feds think you're above the law or something. Ashley's patience was wearing dangerously thin. I'm not scamming anyone. I'm doing my job, and right now you're preventing me from getting home. If you would just call my supervisor, this could all be cleared up. But Jackson wasn't interested in clearing anything up. He was interested in asserting his authority, in making her feel small, in showing her that it didn't matter who she was or what she had accomplished here, in this moment in the one with the power. Let me ask you something, Jackson said, his tone mockingly casual. You think you can just flash that little badge and get away with anything, huh? Just because you're in the Secret Service? Newsflash, no one's above the law. Especially not people like you. People like you. The words hit Ashley like a slap. It wasn't even a question anymore. He wasn't stopping her because of the car, or because he thought there was something suspicious about her story. He was stopping her because she was black, because she was a black woman in a nice car in a neighborhood where, in his mind, she didn't belong. And now, no matter what she said, no matter how many credentials she provided, he wasn't going to back down. Riley returned from the car, shaking his head slightly. Nothing, he muttered, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. But Jackson wasn't done yet. Keep looking, he barked. There's something here. I know it. Ashley watched as Riley hesitated, clearly torn. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the uncertainty in his stance. He didn't want to be a part of this, but he wasn't strong enough to stand up to Jackson. And then, as if on cue, Jackson reached into his own pocket, pulling out a small plastic bag filled with what looked like white powder. He held it up in the air, a grin spreading across his face. Well, he drawled. What do we have here? Ashley's heart stopped. She hadn't seen where the bag had come from, but it was clear what was happening. He was planting evidence. He was setting her up. This is a joke, she said, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. You know that's not mine. Jackson's grin didn't waver. Sure it's not. But here's the thing, sweetheart, it's your word against mine. And who do you think they're going to believe? The world seemed to slow down around Ashley as she watched Jackson hold up the bag of white powder, his smirk widening with every passing second. Her heart raced, but her mind remained sharp. She had been trained for high-stakes moments, taught how to keep her composure even when the situation spiraled into chaos. But this wasn't just any high-stakes moment. This was personal. The weight of systemic bias, the abuse of power, and the knowledge that no matter what she said or did, Jackson was in control right now. And that control was like a vice tightening around her neck. That's not mine, Ashley repeated, her voice calm but laced with the steel edge of a woman who was both furious and terrified. She didn't flinch. She wouldn't give Jackson the satisfaction of seeing fear in her eyes, though the knot of anxiety in her stomach twisted with every passing second. Jackson's grin faltered for a moment as he saw that she wasn't breaking. She wasn't giving him the reaction he wanted, but he was determined to push her until she did. Doesn't matter, Jackson said, shrugging as if they were discussing something as mundane as a parking ticket. It's in your car. And that's all that counts. Ashley glanced at Riley, who stood behind Jackson, his face pale and his body stiff. His eyes flickered between the bag in Jackson's hand and Ashley, clearly struggling with what he was witnessing. She could see the conflict in him, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He knew this wasn't right, but he hadn't said a word, and in his silence he was complicit. Officer Riley, Ashley said, turning her attention to the younger cop. You saw that wasn't in my car. You know what's happening here." Riley's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might speak up. His lips parted slightly and he took a half step forward, so that then Jackson shot him a sharp look, a look that communicated everything without words. "Stay in line. Don't step out of place." Riley's mouth closed, and he took a step back, his eyes dropping to the pavement. Ashley's heart sank. She had been counting on Riley to be the voice of reason, to intervene, but he wasn't ready to go against Jackson, and she realized in that moment how alone she truly was. Jackson, emboldened by Riley's continued silence, pocketed the bag and approached Ashley with slow, deliberate steps. His hand moved toward his handcuffs, the cold metal glinting in the fading sunlight. "Step away from the car," Jackson ordered, his voice low and commanding. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Ashley stood her ground, her mind racing through her options. She knew what he was doing. This wasn't about the law, and it wasn't about drugs. This was about power, about Jackson using the badge to exert control over her, to humiliate her, to remind her that in his world she was lesser. "I know my rights," Ashley said firmly, her voice unwavering. "You have no grounds to arrest me, and you're planting false evidence. If you go through with this, you will face consequences." Jackson's eyes darkened, his jaw clenching as he took another step closer. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. "Because from where I'm standing, you're the one in cuffs, sweetheart." The use of sweetheart sent a jolt of anger through Ashley's veins, but she forced herself to stay calm. Anger wouldn't help her here. Logic, professionalism, those were her tools. "Call my supervisor," she said again. "I've given you my credentials. I'm a federal agent, and I have the right to contact my superior officer." But Jackson wasn't interested in rights or protocols. He had already decided how this was going to go. "I'm done listening to you," he said, his voice rising slightly, betraying his frustration at her refusal to back down. "Now, you either comply, or I'll make you comply." Riley shifted uncomfortably in the background, clearly ill at ease with how far things were escalating. Ashley could see it in his posture, the way his hands fidgeted by his sides, but he still didn't say anything. The tension between the two officers was palpable, but Jackson's forceful personality dominated the moment. Ashley made her decision. "I'm not resisting," she said, lifting her hands slightly to show she wasn't a threat, "but I will not let you violate my rights without consequence." Jackson's face twisted in anger at her defiance, and without warning he lunged forward, grabbing her arm with a brutal grip. His fingers dug into her flesh as he yanked her away from the car, the suddenness of the movement causing her to stumble. "Turn around," Jackson barked, forcing her toward the hood of her car. Ashley gritted her teeth as she was slammed against the cold metal of the hood. The shock of the impact sent a wave of pain through her chest, but she refused to cry out. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Jackson quickly twisted her arms behind her back, snapping the handcuffs onto her wrists with unnecessary force. The metal bit into her skin and she winced, but still she didn't say a word. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out how to de-escalate this situation without allowing Jackson to completely strip her of her dignity. Riley stood nearby, his face pale, his body rigid. He looked as though he might be sick, but he still didn't move. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear or indecision, Ashley couldn't tell which. Jackson pushed her toward the patrol car, his grip never loosening. He shoved her roughly into the back seat, slamming the door behind her. Inside the card outside seemed muffled, distant. The thick glass of the windows distorted the sounds of the neighborhood, turning the murmur of distant conversations and the hum of passing cars into an almost surreal backdrop. Ashley sat still, her wrists aching from the cuffs, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, and you knew she had to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help her now, but as she sat in the back of the patrol car, her thoughts turned to the potential consequences of what was happening. She knew how these situations could spiral out of control. She had seen it too many times before, with too many people who looked like her. Jackson stood outside, leaning against the car with a smug look on his face. He had gotten what he wanted: control, power, dominance. To him, this wasn't about justice or the law. It was about putting someone like Ashley in her place. Minutes passed, and the tension only grew. Ashley's mind raced, replaying the events that had led to this moment. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, with two officers who had already decided she was guilty, regardless of the truth. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Ashley saw Jackson pull out his radio, barking orders into it as he glanced toward her through the rearview mirror. She couldn't make out all of his words, but she heard enough. Suspicious individual, narcotics found, resisting arrest. Ashley's heart sank. She knew what that meant. He was already spinning a narrative, shaping the story in a way that would justify everything he had done. In his version of events, she was the aggressor. She was the criminal. The drugs he had planted would be his evidence, and her refusal to comply would be his justification for everything that followed. She needed to act fast. "Officer Riley," Ashley called from the back seat, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. As she leaned forward as much as the cuffs would allow, trying to make eye contact with the younger officer. Riley hesitated, glancing nervously at Jackson, who was still speaking into his radio. For a moment it seemed like Riley might ignore her, might stay silent once again. But something in her voice must have reached him, because he slowly approached the car, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "What is it?" Riley asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Ashley locked eyes with him, her gaze unwavering. "You know this isn't right," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "You know what Jackson is doing is illegal. You saw him plant those drugs. You can stop this." Riley shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting back to Jackson. I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You do know," Ashley pressed, her voice growing more insistent. "You don't have to protect him. He's breaking the law, and you're an accomplice if you don't speak up." Riley took a step back, his face pale, his breathing shallow. He looked like a man on the edge, caught between doing what was right and following the orders of his partner. For a moment, Ashley thought she had reached him. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his hands trembled at his sides. But then Jackson approached, his expression hardening as he noticed Riley standing near the patrol car. "What are you doing?" Jackson asked, his voice sharp. Riley straightened up immediately, stepping away from the car and shaking his head. "Nothing," he muttered, avoiding Jackson's gaze. Jackson's eyes narrowed as he glanced between Riley and Ashley. "Get back to the car," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Riley nodded quickly and moved back toward the front of the patrol car, his body tense, his movements stiff. Ashley watched him go, her heart sinking. She had been so close to breaking through, but now it seemed that Riley's fear of Jackson outweighed his sense of justice. Jackson turned his attention back to Ashley, his smirk returning. "Nice try," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But you're not getting out of this that easy." The silence in the back of the patrol car was deafening. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into Ashley's wrists as she sat hunched forward, trying to steady her breathing. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her mind remained sharp, assessing every possible outcome. She had been in tense situations before, but this one was different. This wasn't a hostile foreign threat or a cyber breach. This was the systemic injustice she had fought against her entire life, now aimed directly at her. And the worst part, she was entirely alone. Outside, Jackson paced near the patrol car, speaking into his radio again, likely fabricating more details to cover his actions. Ashley could see his smug grin even from where she sat, a grin that made her stomach churn with disgust. He thought he had won. He thought he had her cornered. But Ashley wasn't done yet. She knew there had to be a way to turn this around, to regain control of the narrative before it spiraled completely out of her hands. The patrol car door swung open, and Riley appeared. His face was tight with apprehension, and he looked even more uncomfortable than before. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure Jackson wasn't watching too closely, before stepping closer to the car. His hands rested awkwardly on his belt, as if unsure what to do with them. "Listen," Riley started, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't want this to get any worse than it already has." Ashley straightened up, watching him carefully. There was hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. He was torn. Ashley could see that. She could sense that Riley was struggling with the weight of the situation, realizing the gravity of what Jackson was doing. But still, he hadn't spoken out. "You have to stop this," Ashley said quietly, keeping her tone measured but firm. "You know this isn't right. You don't have to go along with him." Riley glanced back toward Jackson again, clearly nervous. "I don't have a choice," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "He's my partner. He calls the shots." Ashley felt a surge of frustration rise in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. She couldn't afford to lose her composure now. "You always have a choice," she said. "If you let this continue, you're just as guilty as he is. You're better than this, Riley. Don't let him drag you down with him." For a brief moment, Riley's resolve seemed to waver. His eyes darted toward the ground, his hands fidgeting by his sides. But then, as if Jackson's presence loomed too large in his mind, he straightened up again, shaking his head. "I can't," he whispered. I can't." With that, Riley backed away, closing the door behind him. The sharp click of the lock echoed inside the car, sealing Ashley's fate even tighter. She watched as Riley returned to Jackson's side, the younger officer's shoulders hunched in defeat. He wasn't going to help her. She had hoped that appealing to his sense of morality might sway him, but the fear of Jackson's authority had won out. Ashley leaned her head back against the seat, her mind racing. She needed to find another way out. She couldn't wait for Riley to grow a backbone. It was clear he wasn't strong enough to stand up to Jackson. Time was running out, and with each passing minute, Jackson was building a case against her, a false narrative that would be hard to unravel if it went too far. Suddenly, Jackson walked back toward the patrol car, his face set in a smug grin. He opened the door with a theatrical flourish, as if savoring the moment. "Well, sweetheart," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension, "it looks like you're coming with us down to the station." Ashley's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Jackson yanked her out of the car, his grip rough on her arm, and marched her toward his own patrol car, where she would be transported downtown. Riley followed behind, his face pale, clearly uncomfortable but saying nothing. As they reached Jackson's car, Ashley felt a sudden surge of pain in her side. The stress of the situation, combined with the rough handling, was beginning to take a physical toll on her. She grimaced, trying to hide the discomfort, but Jackson noticed. "Oh, what's this?" Jackson sneered. "Feeling a little sick, are we?" Ashley gritted her teeth, refusing to show weakness. "I'm fine," she muttered, though her body told a different story. The pressure in her side was growing, and her wrists throbbed from the tight cuffs. But she wasn't about to let Jackson see her struggle. Jackson shoved her into the backseat of his patrol car, slamming the door with unnecessary force. He then turned to Riley, nodding toward the front. "Let's get her downtown," Jackson ordered. "Time to teach this one a lesson." Riley hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Ashley in the backseat. For a moment it seemed like he might object, but once again he stayed silent. He climbed into the front seat, his expression a mix of guilt and resignation. The drive to the station was tense and silent. The city streets blurred past the windows, the lights of passing cars casting ear reflections inside the patrol car. Ashley stared straight ahead, her mind racing through possible scenarios. She needed to get in contact with anyone who could intervene, but with her hands cuffed and her phone confiscated, she had no way to reach out. The car pulled up to the station, and Jackson wasted no time yanking Ashley out of the back seat. His grip was firm, almost painful, as he led her inside. The station was bustling with activity officers milling about, phones ringing, paperwork being shuffled from desk to desk. But none of them paid much attention to Jackson and his new prisoner. To them, this was just another routine arrest. Jackson led Ashley to the booking area, where she was forced to sit on a hard plastic chair. He began processing her arrest, filing paperwork with a smug grin on his face. Riley stood off to the side, still looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. Ashley glanced around the station, searching for any sign of hope, any sign of someone who might step in and question what was happening. And then, just as Jackson was about to finish the paperwork, the station phone rang. Jackson glanced at it, clearly annoyed by the interruption, but answered it anyway. "Yeah," he barked into the receiver. For a moment, there was silence as the person on the other end of the line spoke. Jackson's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of confusion passing over his face. "What?" Jackson said, his voice sharper now. "Who?" Ashley couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she could see Jackson's posture stiffen as he listened. His eyes darted toward her, and for the first time since the ordeal began, the smug confidence on his face faltered. "I don't care who she says she is," Jackson snapped, though there was a noticeable edge of uncertainty in his voice. "We've got her on possession." He was cut off by the person on the other end, and whatever they were saying seemed to hit Jackson like a punch to the gut. His jaw tightened, and his knuckles whitened around the phone. "What do you mean, federal jurisdiction?" Jackson hissed, lowering his voice. "This is a local arrest. We don't need." Another pause, followed by more agitated muttering from Jackson. His face had gone from smug to angry, and now a shadow of fear had crept into his eyes. Ashley watched him closely, her mind racing. Someone had gotten through to him. Someone with enough power to shake his confidence. Finally, Jackson slammed the phone down with a growl, his face flushed with frustration. He turned toward Riley, who was watching the whole exchange with wide eyes. "Get her out of here," Jackson muttered through clenched teeth. "We've got bigger problems now." Riley blinked in surprise. "What?" "But you said." "I don't care what I said." Jackson snapped, his voice rising. "We've got the feds breathing down our necks now. Just get her out of my sight." Ashley's pulse quickened as she realized what was happening. Someone from her agency, or perhaps even higher, had intervened. The call had rattled Jackson, and now he was scrambling to cover his tracks. Riley moved toward Ashley, fumbling with the keys to the handcuffs. His hands trembled as he unlocked them, and as the metal cuffs fell away from Ashley's wrists, she rubbed her sore skin, relief washing over her. But even as the cuffs came off, the tension in the room remained thick. This wasn't over yet. Jackson stood off to the side, watching with a stormy expression. His arrogance had been replaced by something darker fear mixed with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, and it was clear that he was struggling to maintain control. "You got lucky," Jackson muttered, his voice low and venomous. "But don't think for a second that this is over." Ashley met his gaze, her eyes hard. "You're right. It's not over. Not by a long shot." With that, she stood up, rubbing her wrists once more. Riley stepped back, avoiding her gaze, his face pale and sweaty. He had finally released her, but it was clear that he was in way over his head. As Ashley walked out of the station, her mind was already racing ahead. She knew she had to act, quickly report everything, get her side of the story out before Jackson could spin his lies any further. This was no longer just about her. This was about holding people like Jackson accountable, about exposing the corruption and prejudice that had led to this moment. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The cold night air hit Ashley like a wall as she stepped out of the station, her wrists still aching from the handcuffs. Despite her release, her mind was spinning, calculating her next move. The gravity of what had just happened was sinking in. She had narrowly avoided being framed for a crime she didn't commit, but the real battle was only just beginning. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Behind her, the doors of the station slammed shut, and she knew Jackson's seething glare was still burning into her back. He had lost this round, but he wasn't about to give up without a fight. His arrogance, his hunger for control, it wasn't going to let him walk away quietly. She had no doubt that Jackson was already working on a way to spin this in his favor, to cover his tracks and maintain his authority. But now, the game had changed. Ashley had allies, people in her corner who outranked even Jackson. She needed to move quickly. Every second counted. Ashley reached into her coat pocket and retrieved her phone. The screen flickered to life, the bright display reflecting off her tense expression. She quickly dialed her superior officer, hoping to get through before Jackson could attempt any further damage control. The phone rang twice before her boss. Special Agent Martin Dias picked up. His deep voice was laced with concern the moment he spoke. "Ashley," he said, "what the hell happened? I just got a call about you being arrested." Ashley exhaled slowly, trying to keep her voice steady as she explained, "Jackson, Officer Jackson. He planted drugs in my car. I had all my credentials, but he didn't care. He framed me, and I know he's going to try to spin this. I need your help." There was a pause on the other end, and she could hear Martin's sharp intake of breath, planting evidence. Jesus. "Okay, listen. We've already escalated this up the chain. The director of the Secret Service is aware, and we're getting federal attorneys involved. Jackson's in deep shit. But we need to make sure there's no room for him to wiggle out of this." Ashley's mind raced. Jackson's position wasn't just in jeopardy. If they played this right, his career would be over, and the entire precinct could come under scrutiny for corruption. But that wouldn't happen if Jackson managed to manipulate the situation further. She had seen how these cases went. The truth could easily get lost in a web of lies, bureaucracy, and cover-ups. "What do we need to do?" Ashley asked, her voice firm and focused. "We're sending a team. Martin replied. They'll be at the station within the hour to secure any evidence, body cam footage, and statements. But I need you to stay close to that station. Don't let Jackson or his people bury anything before we get there. Ashley's pulse quickened. She didn't want to step foot back into that place so soon, not after what had just happened. But she knew Martin was right. Jackson wouldn't go down without a fight, and the more time he had alone, the more he could manipulate the situation to his advantage. She needed to be there to make sure that didn't happen. Understood, she said, her resolve hardening. I'm not letting him get away with this. They hung up, and Ashley turned to face the looming police station once more. She knew what she was walking into. It wouldn't be easy. The system wasn't built to protect people like her, even when she wore a badge. But she wasn't just a victim in this story, she was an agent, trained to navigate the most demon-difficult of situations. And this time, the system had messed with the wrong woman. As she walked back toward the station, she saw the faint glow of headlights approaching from the corner of the street. A sleek, black SUV pulled up to the curb, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. It was obvious from his demeanor that he was federal. His crisp posture and sharp gaze gave him away instantly. "Agent Harris?" the man asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Ashley nodded, recognizing him as one of the federal attorneys who often worked alongside her division. His name was Agent Miller, a sharp legal mind with a reputation for being relentless in the courtroom. "Good to see you," Miller said, offering a quick handshake. "We've already started the process. The FBI is aware, and we're pushing for an internal investigation into the precinct." Ashley felt a small flicker of relief, but she knew better than to celebrate too soon. Jackson was still inside, and as long as he had access to the evidence, he could manipulate things in his favor. "We need to move fast," Ashley said. "Jackson will try to cover his tracks." Miller nodded. "That's why we're here. We've already requested the body cam footage from the officers on the scene. If anything's been tampered with, we'll know. But we need you inside to provide a formal statement." Ashley swallowed the lump in her throat. She had been prepared to face Jackson again, but that didn't make it any easier. Going back inside meant facing the hostility of the entire precinct of a place that had just treated her as nothing more than a suspect, despite her federal status. Still, she knew what was at stake. If Jackson got away with this, it would send a message that even agents like her, people who had dedicated their lives to the law, could be treated as criminals simply because of the color of their skin. She couldn't let that happen. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady. Together they walked toward the entrance of the station. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Officers milled about, their eyes darting toward Ashley and Miller as they entered. She could feel the weight of their gazes, some curious, others hostile. They knew what was happening. The word had already spread about the arrest, and now the presence of federal agents was drawing even more attention. Ashley's eyes scanned the room, locking onto Jackson, who was standing by his desk, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was a mask of barely contained fury. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. But now that federal agents were involved, his arrogance was cracking, giving way to anger. Well, Jackson drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm as Ashley and May and Miller approached. "Look who's back. What couldn't stay away?" Miller stepped forward, his expression cold and professional. "We're here for the body cam footage and any other evidence related to Agent Harris's arrest." Jackson's smirk faltered slightly, but he didn't back down. "We're still processing the paperwork. You'll get what you need when it's ready." Ashley's eyes narrowed as she saw Jackson's grip on control slip further. He wasn't the smug, untouchable cop from earlier. He was stalling, and it was obvious. But Miller wasn't playing games. "You have 30 minutes to produce the footage," Miller said, his tone unyielding. "Or we'll escalate this further." Jackson's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the evidence room, likely to buy himself some time. But Ashley wasn't going to give him that luxury. As Jackson disappeared down the hallway, Ashley leaned toward Miller. "He's going to try to destroy the evidence. I know it." Miller nodded grimly. "We have people monitoring him. If he tries anything, it'll make things worse for him." Despite Miller's assurance, Ashley couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. We knew Jackson wouldn't go down without a fight, and with Riley still under his thumb, there was no telling how far Jackson would go to cover his tracks. Minutes ticked by like hours. Ashley's nerves were on edge as she watched officers come and go, their gazes lingering on her with a mixture of curiosity and resentment. The weight of the precinct's hostility pressed down on her, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let Jackson intimidate her into backing down. Then, finally, Jackson returned, a USB drive in hand. He walked over to Miller, his expression hard. "Here's the footage," he muttered, practically throwing the drive at Miller. Miller caught it, his face impassive. "We'll be reviewing this immediately." Jackson didn't respond, but the tension in the room was palpable. Ashley watched him closely, noting the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was losing control, and he knew it. Without another word, Miller motioned for Ashley to follow him to a nearby conference room where they could review the footage in private. As they entered the room, Miller plugged the USB drive into his laptop, the screen flickering to life as the footage loaded. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the sound of the footage beginning to play. Ashley leaned forward, her eyes locked on the screen as the events of her arrest unfolded before her eyes. The video showed everything: the stop, the questions, Jackson's escalating hostility. And then, clear as day, it showed Jackson reaching into his pocket and pulling out the bag of drugs, planting it in her car. Ashley's breath caught in her throat. There it was. Undeniable proof of Jackson's corruption. Her hands trembled slightly as the weight of the moment settled over her. This was it. This was what would bring Jackson down. Miller leaned back in his chair, a satisfied expression on his face. "That's all we need." Ashley nodded, her mind still racing. Jackson had tried to frame her, to destroy her career, and now he was going to face the consequences. But as they stood to leave, Ashley couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Jackson wasn't just one corrupt officer, he was a symptom of a much larger problem. And while bringing him down was a victory, it wouldn't be the end of the fight. As they left the conference room, the precinct seemed quieter, the weight of what had just been uncovered hanging in the air. Jackson was nowhere to be seen, but Ashley knew it wouldn't be long before the fallout began. "Let's get this to the director," Miller said, his voice low. "This is going to blow up fast." Ashley nodded, her jaw set. She was ready for whatever came next. The system had failed her today, but she wasn't going to let it keep failing. Jackson had underestimated her. He had underestimated her strength, her resolve, and now he was going to pay the price. As they walked toward the exit, Ashley felt a sense of closure, but not finality. The road ahead was still long, but now she had the evidence, the support, and the fire to keep fighting. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The morning light streamed through the precinct windows as Ashley returned with Miller and the federal team. Everything felt sharper now, every sound, every step reverberating with tension. She could feel it in the air, the weight of accountability closing in on Officer Jackson and the police department that had protected men like him for too long. The body cam footage was in their hands, undeniable proof of Jackson's corruption and abuse of power. Now it was time to make sure justice was done. Inside the station it was quieter than usual, as if the entire precinct was holding its breath. Word had spread fast. Some officers barely glanced at Ashley as she passed, while others avoided her eyes entirely, their faces tight with tension. The chain of command had been notified, and it wouldn't be long before higher authorities arrived. Before that happened, there was something Ashley needed to do. Jackson stood near his desk, still gripping the last threads of his arrogance, though the cracks were visible. His face was a mix of anger and disbelief, his jaw set tightly as he tried to maintain his composure. He had seen the writing on the wall. His career was hanging by a thread, and for the first time he was no longer in control. Riley, standing a few feet behind him, looked pale and nervous, like a man who had been drowning in guilt. Ashley didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward Jackson, her chin lifted high. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had been silenced, humiliated, and mistreated by the system he represented. It was about proving that people like him couldn't operate above the law forever. Jackson sneered as she approached. "You really think this changes anything?" He spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You think one little video is going to take me down?" Ashley met his gaze without flinching, her expression calm and unwavering. "It's over, Jackson. The evidence speaks for itself." For a moment, Jackson faltered. The bravado slipped, and the weight of his situation finally seemed to settle on him. He glanced toward the other officers, some of whom were already muttering under their breath, their confidence in him eroding with each second. They had seen the footage too, and they knew what it meant. But Jackson wasn't going down without a fight. He clenched his fists, his voice rising in anger. "You don't know how this works," he growled. "I've got people in my corner. You're nothing but a badge and some paperwork. You think you can change anything? You think you can take me down?" Ashley stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "I don't need to take you down, Jackson. You've done that yourself." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. For a brief second, the entire room seemed to pause. Even the officers who had been avoiding the confrontation turned to watch, their expressions a mixture of uncertainty and curiosity. They could see that this was different, that Jackson's arrogance, his bravado, was crumbling. And then, as if on cue, the doors to the station opened, and in walked two high-ranking officials from Internal Affairs, accompanied by Miller and two federal agents. The tension in the room ratcheted up as the officials approached, their faces set with grim determination. For one of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a crisp navy suit, stepped forward. "Officer Jackson," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "you're under arrest for evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights. Please surrender your badge and firearm." For a split second, Jackson's face went blank, as though he hadn't processed what was happening, and the color drained from his face. He took a half step back, his hands clenching into fists. "This is bullshit," he muttered, his voice shaky. "You can't do this. You can't touch me." But the officials weren't here to argue. The woman stepped forward again, her tone unyielding. "Your actions are on video, Officer Jackson. You've violated the law, and you'll face the consequences." Jackson's eyes darted around the room, searching for anyone to back him up, but no one moved. The officers who had once stood by his side were now silent, their faces cold and distant. Riley, pale and sweating, looked down at the floor, unable to meet Jackson's gaze. There was no escape. Realizing that he had no allies left, Jackson's defiance faltered. His shoulders sagged, and with a growl of frustration, he yanked his badge off his chest, tossing it onto the floor. He fumbled with his gun holster, ripping the firearm from his belt and slamming it onto the desk. As the federal agent stepped forward to handcuff him, Jackson shot one last venomous look at Ashley. "Do you think this is justice?" he snarled. "This isn't over." Ashley didn't respond. She simply watched as the agent secured Jackson's wrists in handcuffs, their grip firm as they led him away. His angry muttering faded as he was taken out of the station, his footsteps heavy with the weight of his downfall. For the first time, Ashley allowed herself a breath of relief. But the moment was bittersweet. Jackson's arrest was a victory, yes, but it was only the beginning. He was just one officer in a system that had allowed people like him to thrive unchecked for years. The fight for justice wasn't over, it had only just begun. As Jackson was escorted out, Riley stood frozen, still staring at the floor. Ashley turned toward him, her expression softening just slightly. She could see the guilt written all over his face, the weight of his silence finally crashing down on him. "You could have spoken up," Ashley said quietly but firmly. "It didn't have to get this far." Riley swallowed hard, his eyes flicking up to meet hers for just a moment before dropping again. I didn't know what to do," he whispered. "I was scared." Ashley studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fear isn't an excuse, Officer Riley. You saw what was happening, and you did nothing. But you have a chance to make it right. Speak the truth." Riley looked as though he might break down right then and there, but he gave a small, hesitant nod. Ashley could only hope he would follow through. As the dust began to settle, Miller approached her, his expression somber but respectful. "You did well, Ashley," he said. "Jackson's going to face the full weight of the law now." Ashley nodded, but her mind was still turning, still thinking ahead. "This isn't just about Jackson," she said quietly. "It's about every officer like him. It's about the system that allows people like him to get away with this." Miller nodded, understanding her meaning. "We'll keep pushing," he said. "This is just the start." Ashley allowed herself a small smile, the first hint of relief she'd felt all day. "Good, because I'm not done fighting." With that, she turned and walked out of the station, her head held high. The battle wasn't over, but today justice had won a crucial victory. And Ashley Harris wasn't going to stop until the entire system that allowed people like Jackson to operate unchecked was torn down, piece by piece. The sound of Jackson's angry muttering faded as the heavy doors of the precinct shut behind him. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air inside the station seemed lighter. The oppressive tension that had lingered for hours was beginning to lift, replaced by a strange quiet. It was as though everyone was processing what had just happened, the fall of a man who had long believed himself untouchable. Ashley stood near the exit, watching the officers around her. Some were still stunned, their gazes avoiding hers. Others busied themselves with paperwork, doing their best to act as if nothing had happened. But it had happened. Jackson's arrest was a watershed moment, one that couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug. The corruption and prejudice that had infected the precinct had been brought to light, and there was no going back. Agent Miller, who had been standing nearby, finally spoke, breaking the silence. "It's done," he said quietly. "Jackson's career is over. He'll face federal charges, and with the body cam footage, he doesn't stand a chance." Ashley nodded, though her expression remained serious. "Good," she said, her voice steady. "But this is just the beginning. Jackson was just one part of the problem." Miller tilted his head, acknowledging the truth in her words. "You're right. But it's a start. The internal investigation will continue, and I'm sure more officers will be held accountable. It'll take time, but change is coming." Ashley glanced around the precinct, her eyes lingering on the faces of the officers who had been silent, who had watched as Jackson abused his power but said nothing. There was still so much work to be done. Jackson's fall was just the tip of the iceberg, an important victory, but far from the complete solution. She knew that systems like this didn't change overnight. They resisted, they pushed back, and they protected those who upheld the status quo. But with Jackson gone, a crack had formed in the armor, and that crack would only grow larger with time. As Ashley walked toward the front door, she saw Officer Riley standing near the desk, his posture stiff and his face pale. He had been a key witness to Jackson's actions, yet he had said nothing until it was too late. Ashley could see the guilt written all over his face, the weight of his silence bearing down on him. She paused in front of him, her eyes locking onto his. Riley looked down, unable to hold her gaze. There was no defiance left in him, only remorse. "I'm sorry," Riley whispered, his voice barely audible. I should have done something." Ashley studied him for a moment, letting the silence hang between them. She could see that he was torn apart by regret, but she also knew that regret wasn't enough. A regret didn't undo the damage that had been done. Regret didn't change the fact that he had stood by while Jackson tried to destroy her life. "You should have," Ashley agreed, her voice quiet but firm. "But you didn't, and now you have to live with that." The Riley's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, Ashley almost felt sorry for him. Almost. She knew he was a product of the same system that had allowed Jackson to thrive, a system that encouraged silence in the face of wrongdoing, a system that demanded loyalty to the badge above all else, that didn't excuse his actions. He had made a choice, and choices had consequences. "But it's not too late to make it right," Ashley continued, softening slightly. "You can still tell the truth. You can still be a part of fixing this." Riley swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I will," he promised, his voice hoarse. "I'll make a statement. I'll tell them everything." Ashley gave him a final look, a mixture of disappointment and hope. She wasn't sure if Riley would truly follow through, but it was a start. And that was all she could ask for right now, a small step in the right direction. With a nod, Ashley turned and left the station, the cool evening air a welcome relief from the stifling tension inside. As she walked down the steps, the weight of the past few hours finally began to lift from her shoulders. But with that weight gone, a new burden settled in its place, the burden of responsibility. Jackson's arrest was a victory, but it wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a message from Martin Diaz, her superior at the Secret Service. "Diaz, we need you in the office tomorrow. Higher-ups want to discuss what happened today. They're talking about setting up a task force. I want you on it." A task force. Ashley felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger. Maybe this was the beginning of real, systemic change, not just in this precinct, but in departments across the country. She had always believed that change was possible, even when it seemed like an impossible uphill battle. And now it seemed like the fight was finally gaining traction. Ashley typed out a quick response to Martin, confirming that she'd be there first thing in the morning. As she put her phone away, she felt a sense of purpose settle over her. This wasn't just about Jackson anymore. This was about fixing a broken system, about holding those in power accountable, and about ensuring that no one else had to go through what she had. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Ashley was ready for it. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, and she wasn't going to stop now. As she walked down the quiet street, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement, Ashley allowed herself a moment of peace. Jackson was gone, but the fight for justice was far from over, and she was ready for whatever came next.